Hello. Thanks, Marc, et al. So my name is Jesse Olszynko-Gryn. I'm a research scholar in the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, where I head a laboratory for oral history and experimental media. It's my great pleasure and honor to moderate this first panel on genocide, apartheid, and settler colonialism with two of my favorite people in Berlin and the world, historian Tamar Novick and legal scholar Nahed Samour. The point of this panel is to bring history and law into productive dialogue by jointly interrogating a few of the key words that are central to the formation of our Verein from a historical and legal perspective. So once again, those keywords are genocide, apartheid, and settler colonialism. Tamar is a historian of technology and environment in the Middle East at Humboldt University and an old friend. She's soon to be starting a professorship at TU Munich, and previously we were colleagues at the Max Planck. Her wonderful and wonderfully titled book, Milk and Honey, Technologies of Plenty in the Making of a Holy Land, last year was a finalist for the Rachel Carson Prize and won the prestigious George Perkins Marsh Prize for Best Book in Environmental History. Nahed is a research associate at as she mentioned, at Radboud University in the Netherlands and a new friend. She studied law and Islamic studies at the University of Bonn, Beirut, SOAS, Humboldt University, Harvard, and Damascus, and has published widely on Islamic and international human rights law, among other topics. She's also clerked at the Court of Appeals in Berlin and held a postdoctoral position at the Eric Castre Institute of International Law and Human Rights at the University of Helsinki in Finland, among other affiliations. And not least, she is co-editor of the book Arab Berlin, Dynamics of Transformation, in which Islam Dayeh, whom you've met, has also contributed. We don't have much time for these flash talk micro panels, so without further ado, I hand it over to Tamar first.
So I'm a historian of science, technology, and the environment, and I focus specifically on early and mid-20th century Palestine and Israel. As part of the kind of basic premise of these fields of research, I look at how the environment, the natural world, are organized and categorized and understood in relation to the social world, to culture, to politics. And I focus specifically on livestock management and on environmental policies. The approach, what's really nice about this approach to research is that it reveals some things that are otherwise invisible in the historical record. So historical actors would say things about animals, for example, that they wouldn't dare saying about people. So for example, beekeepers around the world would talk about the attempt to try and the best race of bees, and using this category until maybe late as 1970s, when this category is, of course, at the time when is already obsolete. And strikingly, when talking about discussing Palestine and Israel, so in British Palestine and early Israeli state officials and also conservators were really occupied with the specific animal, the herding goat. So this was most common mammal in Palestine, very important to the Palestinian subsistence economy. And it interfered, it came to collide with state plans of afforestation. So they started calling it a menace, a devil, a black animal, environmentally hazardous, and also interfering or dangerous to governance. And with these terms, they also it followed with these plans of eradicating this animal, and then so counting it, eradicating, and we already see how managing this kind of world, the natural world, has to do with the political realm. During the years of my research, I came to use the term settler colonialism to explain the historical reality of Palestine and Israel. And so this is a term that has gained a lot of prominence in the last 3 decades or so, trying to analyze or to explain circumstances in which indigenous population is systematically replaced by settler one. And when it comes to Palestine, this category is often dismissed as being, the use of this category is dismissed as being merely ideological or only a rhetorical tool, but I've actually found it to be a very important one. So just for example, how would you explain the fact that Israel's first environmental law in 1950 was a law against this animal, this black herding goat? And this law also included a plan to annihilate all this goat population, to kill all goats and replace them with animals that were considered good, that were considered environmentally and economically viable, namely cows and sheep. And also, as the director of the Ministry of Agriculture said in Parliament when discussing this law, we managed to get rid of the Arabs. Now we have the opportunity of getting rid of the goats as well. So a frequent critique about using a term like sector colonialism or similarly about genocide is that the argument would say there's never a plan. You can't, there's no, in the historical record, you don't see a plan showing that this was the intention. But when you look at livestock, or in this case of goats, there actually is. It's a plan in print. And if we consider livestock to be such essential means of production and ways of managing the land, then this example speaks volumes. And I want to say that this is not such plans that have this element of replacement, of annihilation, of separation, are not only visible in the realm of livestock, but also, for example, in a variety of infrastructural projects. So I'm thinking, for example, about laying out electricity lines or in the construction of roads. And I'm referring here very briefly to recent works by prominent historians of the Middle East. And then further, I'd say that settler colonialism is also an apt category because basically historical actors were using it at the time. So early settlers would talk about their, say, towns as colonies, but more so they were understanding of the process of settlement as one being tied to colonialism. So just as an example of this, a title of a publication of a leading agriculturist, Jewish agriculturist in 1928 who was trying to promote the cow as the basis of the settler economy, and that title was "The Dairy Industry is the Basis of Colonization in Palestine." So fundamentally, these historical perspective helps us ground such categories that were used and are so important to understanding reality in concrete historical lived experiences and in past plans and potential futures, some of which were materialized and some which were not. And
thank you, Tamar, for briefly outlining how someone who studies the history of science and environmental history and engages with historic evidence comes to conclude that this category of settler colonialism aptly describes both past and present developments in Palestine, Israel. Now, as someone myself who works with normative legal categories such as genocide and apartheid, I specifically research how particular historic catastrophes are translated into universal legal concepts and how they shape subsequent legal interpretations. Now, in fact, international law emerges from catastrophes, from blood and suffering, whether it be colonialism, slavery, or the imperial subordination of peoples around the world, particularly but not exclusively with the rise of European imperialism in and beyond the 19th century. One such historical normative example is the transformation of the killing, starvation, disease, and destruction suffered by specific peoples, in this case Armenians and European Jews, at particular times and places into illegal categories such as genocide. This term seeks to encompass these different forms of fatal violence under a single concept. It's an approach to structurally, systematically allow all these types of violences to be coined in one concept. So, and it was obviously later defined by the UN Genocide Convention in 1948. This legal category is now under the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice and subsequently has been incorporated with the exact same wording into the statutes of various international legal tribunals, such as the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, as well as the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. This legal development emerged from the understanding that genocides have occurred in the past and may occur in the future, again and again and again. Genocide, after all, is not an exception, but tragically often the norm in case of violence. And with every genocide that is prosecuted in court, whether it involves the Bosnian Muslims, the Rwandan Tutsis, or the Muslim Rohingya of Myanmar, we as a scholarly community, scientific community, and as global lifelong learners increasingly and painfully become more familiar with the category of genocide. This includes the hidden and forgotten genocides, those that never reach international or domestic courts, those that never get any recognition as genocides, or those acknowledged but deeply unsatisfactorily addressed, such as the Armenian genocide, the genocide against the Roma and Sinti, or the Herero and Nama genocide. These are genocides that did not lead to reparations, restitutions, or rehabilitation, and perhaps most crucially, to rehumanization. History matters for law, and we are currently witnessing an expansion of our collective understanding of genocide, both doctrinally, legally, as well as in the humanities. Doctrinally, Germany, in a joint statement with 5 other countries, Canada, the UK, the Netherlands, Denmark, and France, explicitly emphasized that forced displacement and targeted attacks on children must be understood as part of genocide. This was conveyed during the proceedings on genocide in the case of the Gambia versus Myanmar. In the humanities, we are expanding our interdisciplinary understanding of genocide, complementing legal doctrine by exploring concepts such as scholasticide, urbanicide, domicide, ecocide, herbicide, and cultural genocide. Some aspects historically excluded from the UN Genocide Convention, and others are now becoming awfully clear. These additional dimensions help reveal the full horror of genocide, knowledge that has often been produced at the expense of many peoples, particularly the Palestinian people today. Similar research has been conducted on the legal category of apartheid, which initially described the specific experience of Black people and people of color under apartheid in South Africa, starting in 1948. So this number 1948 comes back again and again. So however, the UN Anti-Apartheid Convention explicitly states, quote, apartheid such as in South Africa, with the phrase such as, indicating that South Africa was only one example, even back then. Other territories, such as Southwest Africa, today's Namibia, or Rhodesia, today's Zimbabwe, also practice the state policy of apartheid. Today, the UN General Assembly applies this concept in a fact-finding mission with respect to the Rohingya in Myanmar. So there is a history of unrecognized apartheid as well. For instance, the USA and Australia were never condemned by the UN for practicing racial segregation and apartheid against African Americans, Aborigines, and Torres Strait Islanders in the 1950s and 1960s. Today, the term apartheid still carries the historical weight of real lived experiences, yet it has evolved beyond its initial application in the UN Anti-Apartheid Convention. It is now ratified in Article 3 of the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, CERT, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, and it's recognized by customary law as jus cogens, compelling international law that cannot be negotiated away. In July 2024, the International Court of Justice confirmed that Israel's action against the Palestinian people violates Article 3 of CERT, which prohibits segregation and apartheid. This ruling underscores the urgent call to address both the horrors of the past and the present for the sake of a shared future. Research like the one Tamar and I are conducting attempts to view history not as a deadlock, but as a set of options that have yet to be fully explored. Thank you.
Okay, sorry, Tamar, we have time for one question. The one I've written down is why is it important / necessary / productive for scholars such as the two of you with complementary sets of expertise in history and law to work together on Palestine specifically and within this Verein? And maybe, if you don't want to answer that one, what kind of resources for the present and future do you imagine finding in the past through historical research? And the answers have to be short.
Okay, one little thing is that, I write about animals, and obviously this history is very political, but coming to discuss this history of these terms in the legal sphere gives it a completely different balance to these terms, and kind of helps think of why they're relevant and how they can be together, make sense for intervention in the current historical moment and future examples.
So law doesn't only need history, it needs evidence, right? That's what lawyers are interested in, evidence. And they're also interested, maybe with historians together, to build an archive, right? These archives are very important, past, present, and future. So it's not without, of course, I mean, the International Court of Justice, in one of its provisional measures in the South Africa versus Israel case, orders Israel to make sure that evidence can be gathered, right? So the very concept of evidence and what qualifies as historical evidence that can then be translated into kind of legal practice and interpretation and action, of course. That's exactly, I think, that's the kind of building blocks, the evidence, that come from science and environmental history. And we know that, whether it's people from forensic architecture and other NGOs that are doing exactly that, helping us to locate evidence, visualize evidence, and helping the lawyers to bring together this evidence to form the new building blocks, because every catastrophe brings about new international law. And I think this will also be one of the moments where possibly settler colonialism or the Nakba could become also a new legal terminology for international law.